Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be taking a look at a new book, a very interesting book titled The Hidden History of American Democracy, Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. And the author of that book is Mr. Thom Hartmann. Mr. Thom Hartmann is an American radio personality, author, former psychotherapist, businessman, and progressive political commentator whose talk show has been rated in the top 10 shows for over a decade by Talkers Magazine. Thom Hartmann, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Hey, Bill, thanks so much for inviting me back. It's nice to see you again.
I appreciate you being with me. Thank you so very much. We're going to get into your book. In fact, why don't we just dive into it right now? The founding fathers, for give them credit or not credit, whatever the case might be, they moved from a monarchical situation or monarchy or rule by kings and that type of thing into a more of a republic with democratic institutions. How did they make that transition to do that? That seemed like a quantum leap because we think of democracy correctly or incorrectly being formulated with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and even before that, probably. But how did they decide to do that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was a transition, and the prevailing wisdom, European wisdom at the time, by and large, was that democracy doesn't work. That it lasted fewer than a few hundred years at the most, arguably less than 100 years. Was sort of democratic in the beginning, but quickly turned into, Hail Caesar. And a lot of that started to change, that sentiment in Europe, which influenced the founders and the framers of the Constitution hugely in the early 1700s. Throughout the 1600s, the French trappers, mostly fur trappers, had quite successfully penetrated the western part of the eastern, of New York State, Massachusetts, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, that area. And they had brought with them French missionaries, mostly Jesuits. And one of the tribes, the Hurons, associated with the Iroquois, welcomed these French missionaries. Because they were doing a lot of commerce, with the French trappers, and the missionaries then started writing an annual report, essentially, back to France to tell everybody about what they were experiencing, living with the savages, and they were pretty astonished, actually, and very respectful of the way that these Huron people were living. That they had a functioning government, that it was a functioning democracy, essentially, small d democracy, that there was no poverty, that there was no great wealth, there were no kings, there were no princes, there were no jails, there were no police, there were no prisons, and yet their society worked and had worked for apparently thousands of years along these lines. This created these letters back home, essentially, to France, some of them running 100 pages or more annually, caught a huge audience from starting in the 1720s mostly, right up through the 1780s and 90s.
Well, let's fast forward to 1787 when they were developing the U.S. Constitution. There's so many parts of the U.S. Constitution that we're debating today. And we see an erosion of, at least I think I see an erosion of some of the constitutional aspects. For example, there was really an intense focus on the separation of church and state. That is being deteriorated every day. We can see that there's a movement to really Christian schools or whatever, or charter schools or whatever the case might be. Why did they focus so much on that separation of church and state?
First of all, they had within their memory, and in fact in living memory, grand persecutions by religious leaders. The Salem witch trials had been 100 years earlier, but Massachusetts at the time of the Constitution was being written still in most parts of Massachusetts, you were required to pay a tax to fund the local church. And if you didn't show up on Sunday, you could be punished or fined for church services for not showing up. So there was a concern about that. These people also knew the history of England, and they were very familiar with Cromwell and the whole, British Civil War, essentially, that was around religion. To a large extent. And so they were strongly of the opinion. Now, I say they, it wasn't unanimous, but broadly speaking, the founders of this and the framers of the Constitution were of the opinion that church and state should be separate for two reasons. One, the merging of church and state is bad for state. Governments get controlled by religion and religious figures, and that usually turns out poorly. The other was, and that was the argument that Jefferson made. Jefferson was a deist; he was not a Christian, as was Franklin, as was George Washington. None of them were Christians, but but they were respectful of Christianity. Jefferson took the four Gospels of the New Testament, cut out all with a razor blade, cut out all the miracles. And that book, it's called the Jefferson Bible, is still in print today, presenting Jesus as a kind of philosopher king. But in any case, that Jefferson and Madison had this ongoing debate through most of their lives. Madison was Jefferson's protege, as well as being the father of the Constitution. And Madison was a church-going, every Sunday church-going, practicing Christian. And he was worried that if the federal government ever started giving money to the churches, that it would corrupt the churches. He wanted his beloved Christianity to remain pure. Jefferson was worried that if a priest ever became president, that would corrupt the nation. And, in other words, if religious figures ever acquired political power. Turns out they were both right. But, for both
on target.
Yeah, for both those reasons, they, in two different places in the Constitution, you have the separation of church and state. And in fact, Madison's first veto, he became president in 1809 following Jefferson leaving office. And his first veto in office was a veto of money that had been appropriated by Congress to pay for the poorhouse in Washington, D.C. that George Washington had been started during the Washington administration. That had up until that point been paid for directly with federal funds. It was our first socialist experiment. The federal government provided housing, clothing, medical care, and food to indigent people. But in 1809, there was this minor religious revival going on in America. And so Congress sent Madison a bill that took money, federal money, and gave it to a church in D.C. to run the poorhouse. And Madison vetoed that. And in his veto message, he said this would set a terrible precedent for the country, and it would be a terrible precedent for Christianity. You don't want this to happen. So the founders were quite clear that there should never be government money supporting religion, and religion should not be determining the policies of government. That mostly in the United States changed. I mean, it's gone back and forth. We had a minor religious revival in the 1820s as well. And another one in the 1890s, out of which came the Seventh-day Adventist Church and others. But the big push to incorporate religion into politics came with the Reagan administration. Reagan hired George W. Bush to be his liaison to the evangelical community, and Bush brought in Jerry Falwell and Franklin Graham and Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed. And then George Herbert Walker Bush tripled down on that when he became president with his very explicit program to funnel federal money into churches in exchange for their giving, political support to the GOP. He called it his 1,000 Points of Light program. And then his son, George W., tripled down or quadrupled down on it when he became president with what he called the faith-based initiatives. All of these things are things that would have made the founders run in the other direction.
You think this is a temporary phenomenon? It seems like we're into another one of these religious revivals and blurring the lines between church and state. Do you think this is temporary, or how do you think it's going to end?
I do think it's temporary. I think that there is a growing awareness within the Christian church broadly, multi-denominational and sectarian, that this is not working out well. There was a fascinating op-ed in Christianity Today last week, written by I'm forgetting his first name. His last name is Moore. I think it's Robert Moore, who is the publisher and editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, talking about the number of pastors who have reached out to him and said that when they preach Jesus, when they preach the Gospels, when they preach from the Sermon on the Mount or Matthew 25, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, care for the homeless, feed the hungry, heal the sick, that when they preach that, they get blowback, that people come up to them afterwards and say, you can drop all that liberal stuff. That's weak. We don't want that weakness in our religion. And he's pretty alarmed about it. And I think that alarm is spreading rapidly and broadly through Christianity. The one problem, of course, is the Supreme Court. We've got a majority Catholic Supreme Court. In fact, I believe there's one Jew and everybody else is Catholic. Elena Kagan is Jewish, and Neil Gorsuch was raised Catholic. He goes to his wife's Presbyterian church, but or whatever, I think a Church of England, but he hasn't renounced Catholicism, and they're hell bent for leather to use religious freedom as an excuse to tolerate basically bigotry. We saw this in the cake baking thing. We saw it more recently, and well, there've been a number of these cases. So
yeah, that's very, very true. I'm glad you mentioned the Supreme Court too, because that's our third co-equal branch of government, so to speak. We have the executive, legislative, executive, and then the Supreme Court system. How do you perceive what's going on today with a Supreme Court that has a popularity rating slightly above used car dealers, I guess? I don't want to give used car dealers a bad name or anything.
That.
In the 20s, lower 30s. And you have several members of that Supreme Court, thanks to ProPublica's really wonderful investigative reporting, that's shown how allegedly corrupt these people are, starting off with Clarence Thomas, who's received hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in pro bono gifts. You've got Samuel Alito. It's been alleged that he's now topped $1 billion. And I'm not sure how you do it with a Supreme Court justice's salary. You've got John Roberts, the Chief Justice. His wife has received large sums of money. Why is it that the Supreme Court does not have a code of ethics, and what can the U.S. Senate do to help rectify this problem? This is absolutely destroying the credibility of the Supreme Court, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Bill. And there is a federal law that that Alito and Thomas and Roberts and perhaps others are in violation of. There is a law that applies to all the federal judiciary, which includes the Supreme Court, that requires disclosure of these kinds of gifts. Thomas has said that he was simply following Scalia's practice. He and Scalia used to go to the Koch brothers events, and they'd get wined and dined by right-wing billionaires all the time. And that's was bad advice. He should have followed the law. He should have disclosed these gifts for the last 20 plus years. But that law needs to be enforced. The problem is that I don't think the executive branch, I don't think the Department of Justice wants to prosecute Supreme Court justices for violations of judicial ethics. And even if they did, where would the case end up? It would end up before the Supreme Court. Right. They're the final arbiters of all disputes between the executive and judicial branch, or between any of the two branches, any two of the branches. So, everybody's just kind of holding their breath and hoping that the court adopts a code of ethics that they themselves can live by. I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen, short of Clarence Thomas resigning. I mean, he's clearly the worst of the bunch, not to mention his wife, trying to overthrow the government of the United States. It's problematic.
It certainly is. And I remember so many people commented, "Oh, what a great shock. What a revelation." This was openly discussed. I remember 20 years ago, Rush Limbaugh on his show was talking about this, talking about what a good friend Clarence Thomas was and how he was going here, hither, and yon with all of these folks, and was actively involved in many of these activities. It just took us a long time to wake up to look at what was going on. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. If you're involved in any type of educational institution or a PBS or community access television station, or you just have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our shows, please feel free to share them. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at a very interesting book by Thom Hartmann, and we're talking about really how the whole concept of democracy and the republic took hold in the United States. Tom, there's so many issues we could talk about, especially with the Supreme Court and what have you, but the Lions, I guess the 800-pound gorilla in the room right now has to be the January 6th failed insurrection, at least up to this point, to overthrow a fair, free election and basically overthrow the U.S. government to some degree. That's been alleged. How do you perceive this as something that the founding fathers never perceived or never conceived, or maybe did, and included something like the 14th Amendment to deal with it later if it did happen? What is your take on that?
Donald Trump led an insurrection against the United States. He did it through legal channels. He did it through physical channels, through brute force on January 6th. There are 6 different places in the Constitution where insurrection is specifically prohibited or criminalized. He violated the laws of the United States. He's now facing almost 100 criminal charges as a consequence of it. And frankly, I hope he goes to prison for it. I think if Richard Nixon had gone to jail or at least been prosecuted for the crimes that he committed against our country, I think it's extremely unlikely that Ronald Reagan would have thought it was a good idea to cut a deal with the Ayatollah to hold on to the hostages to screw Jimmy Carter. I think it's extremely unlikely if Nixon had gone to jail for his crimes that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney would have thought they could get away with lying us into 2 wars that killed over 7,000 Americans and cost us $5 trillion and 500,000 Iraqi and Afghan lives. And I think it's extremely unlikely that Donald Trump would have done half the crimes he did while he was in office. He thought he was immune because Nixon got away with it. And frankly, his closest advisor in all this was Roger Stone, who was with Nixon through all that. He's got Nixon tattooed on his back, literally. The grand lesson of this, I think, is the lesson that we should have learned in 1974, but we didn't, because Jerry Ford that year pardoned Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of speculation now that there's a chance that Donald Trump could actually be reelected unless Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, Section 3 or the 14th Amendment, Section 3 is applied, and that he is precluded from any holding future offices, given his role in the January 6th insurrection. If for some reason, some strange reason, he were reelected, do you think he would actually dismantle the administrative bureaucracy? He would weaponize the governmental agencies, which he started to do right before he left office, that he would pull us out of NATO, he would destroy NATO, probably pull us out of the United Nations, all to the detriment of the United States, everything that would weaken the United States? Do you think that he would actually do that?
With the exception of pulling out of the UN, he's already proclaimed that he will do everything that you just listed, Bill. I mean, he's said that he would direct the Department of Justice to go after Joe Biden, the Biden crime family, and his other political enemies. There is a wall of separation right now that was broken during the Trump administration. It was broken during the Nixon administration. It's why John Mitchell, Nixon's attorney general, went to prison himself. Was for using the Department of Justice for political purposes. But Trump has said that that's what he intends to do. He's openly in favor of Putin's side in the Ukraine conflict. He tried to get us out of NATO. He tried to destroy NATO, actually, when he was president. He would get much more aggressive about that. It would be the end of the American experiment if Trump was elected again. I don't think it's possible. I think if you look at the polling, the one remote possibility would be if sometime close to the election, Joe Biden were to pass away or become incapacitated and Kamala Harris became the president. And then it was a Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump race. Then some of the polling suggests that Donald Trump might win, but we're so far out, and most Americans really don't have a sense of Kamala Harris yet, that I'm not sure that that would necessarily be the case on election day anyway. But yeah, it is a threat. It's a danger to our republic. He is a danger to our republic.
And one of the key institutions that should be providing information, objective information about what is happening politically, culturally, economically, just on across the board, are the U.S. media, mainstream media, plus left-wing talking stations, right-wing talking stations. Well, we have a situation in this country that's really, we're oversaturated with right-wing spin machines. And for example, Fox, which just got hit with the Dominion lawsuit for what, $750 million or something. And Smartmatic is going to sue them for even more than that. Newsmax, which is, I think, under lawsuit, also One American News. But there's no balance as far as providing messages to the American public, is there? I mean, your program does a great job. You've got a few others, but really it's really overloaded with right-wing, especially talk radio, which permeates this country from coast to coast and border to border. How do you perceive the role of the media and what can be done to bring more balance into it? Do we need to reenact the fairness doctrine?
The fairness doctrine to Rush Limbaugh, and it wouldn't force radio stations that carry my show to carry a right-wing show after my show. The fairness doctrine only mandated that political candidates had to have equal time, and when their opponents were on television, and that if the owner or manager of a station offered an opinion on air, and back in the day, like newspapers, radio and TV stations used to run editorials that was the voice of the owner and management, then there had to be a balancing opinion on the other side. I mean, back in the 60s when I worked in radio and produced a talk show that was done by the owner of the station, Chuck Mefford, back in the day at WITL. Part of my job was to find people to do those rebuttals, but it was a small help. The other thing that the fairness doctrine did is it required what was called programming in the public interest, and that was widely understood to be news at the top of the hour. The problem that we have now is, Bill, I think twofold. One is that we've got a bunch of organizations out there that are calling themselves news that are actually opinion machines. The networks that you talked about, these 1,500 right-wing radio stations, and I'm up front on my show. I don't call my show news. You're getting my opinion, and some of my right-wing contemporaries are as well, but. Some of these television networks go out of their way to try to pretend that they're actually providing news to people, and they're not. They're providing, misinformation and disinformation. Sadly, I don't have an easy solution for that. I don't want the government to have the power to take down, right-wing television or radio, because that would mean that they would have the power to take down left-wing television or radio. And what happens when somebody like Trump, Ron DeSantis, becomes president? So I don't see an easy solution. The other part of the problem, particularly with regard to like the 1,500 radio stations or the 200 and some odd Sinclair TV stations, is that in 1996, prior to 96, from the 1920s up until 1996, we had in place laws that regulated how many radio, television, and newspaper stations, how many radio and TV stations and newspapers an individual family or corporation could own, and how many could be owned by the same entity in a single state. And in 96, when Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act, it blew that up. It ended those ownership rules. And the result of that was that Clear Channel, which was a little regional company down in the Southeast that had maybe fewer than 100 stations, I believe, scattered across half a dozen states, within a year, they had 1,000 stations. And they were putting right-wing talk radio on a whole pile of them. And
yes.
Yeah, so now the majority of the radio stations in America are owned by 3 or 4 companies, and that's not healthy.
It certainly is not healthy, and hopefully we can balance it out again without giving the government too much control. Well, Thom Hartmann, these are extremely important topics, and I'm so glad we had a chance to revisit them again. We'll have to get back together soon because there's so many more that we didn't get to. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me on. It's nice to see you again.
Good to see you. My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.